And today our subject is prescribe what is right and proscribe what is wrong. This will be part 8. In this part, we propose to correct the fuqaha's interpretation of the book's injunction to prescribe what is right and to proscribe what is wrong. Al-amr bil-ma'ruf wal-nahy al-munkar. In the hands of the jurists, this divine injunction has been turned into a slogan for the justification of dictatorial rule and autocratic government. We totally disagree with this abuse of the divine word, and we begin our investigation with the study of the 4 binary pairs of terms whose complex meaning have been so carelessly treated by the fuqaha. 1. Halal, haram. 2. Amr, nahy. 3. Samah, man'. 4. Hasan, qabih. These are equals. Deplorably, the fuqaha have not paid much attention to how these pairs to terms differ from each other, with the disastrous result that halal is treated as synonymous with to hasan or mustahsan, and samah or masmuh as to what ought to be prescribed, al-ma'mur bihi. Similarly, haram is seen as just another word for qabih or mustaqbih or man' or mamnu', meaning that what ought to be proscribed, al-manhi anhu. This careless conflation of terms made it only logical by the power of synonymity to link what ought to be prescribed with things that are halal, samah and hasan, and what ought to be proscribed with things that are haram, man' and qabih. Such indiscriminated use of terms, as we will show, is detrimental to a correct understanding of Allah's injunction to prescribe what is right and to proscribe what is wrong. We will discuss each term of this injunction separately and then finally propose a different understanding of it. Let us first quote the verses that contain the injunction. Let there arise out of you a band of people inviting to all that is good, enjoining what is right and forbidding what is wrong. They are the ones to attain felicity. Chapter al-Imran, verse 104. You are the best of peoples evolved for mankind, enjoining what is right, forbidding what is wrong, and believing in God. Chapter al-Imran 110. They believe in God and the last day. They enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong, and they hasten in emulation in all good works. They are in the ranks of the righteous. Chapter al-Imran 114. The hypocrites, men and women, have an understanding with each other. They enjoin evil and forbid what is just, and are close with their hands. Tawbah 67. The believers, men and women, are protectors of one of another. They enjoin what is just and forbid what is evil. They observe regular prayers, practice regular charity, and obey God and His apostle. Chapter Tawbah 71. They are those who, if we established them in the land, establish regular prayer and give regular charity, enjoin the right and forbid wrong. With God rests the end and decision of all affairs. Chapter Hajj 41. Also, O my son, establish regular prayer, enjoin what is just and forbid what is wrong, and bear with patient constancy whatever betide you. For this is firmness of purpose in the conduct of affairs. Luqman 17. Also, for He commands them what is just and forbid them what is evil. He allows them as lawful what is good and pure, and prohibits them from what is bad and impure. He releases them from their heavy burdens and from the yokes that are upon them. Surah A'raf 157. The above verses quote the two terms, what is right, what is wrong, always in conjunction with each other. Other verses mention them separately, as in the following two examples: for divorced women, maintenance should be provided on a reasonable scale, bil ma'ruf. This is a duty on the righteous. Baqarah 241. For prayer restrains from shameful and unjust deeds, al-munkar. And remembrance of God is the greatest thing in life, without doubt, and God knows the deeds that you do. Ankabut 45. Right or wrong is one of those pillars of binary opposition that the book used repeatedly in order to highlight clear and unambiguous contrast. An example: day and night, heaven and earth, blind and seeing, and even and odd, far and near, this world and the next, paradise and hell, knowledge and ignorance, first and last, moral and immoral, rewards and punishment, and so on. To prescribe al-amr, the Arabic noun al-amr is derived from the regular verb amara, which is polysemous. First, it expresses an order to act. The one who issues the order usually enjoys a higher status than the one to whom the order is directed, as is, they say, O Shu'aib, does your prayer command you, ta'amuraka, that we leave off the worship which our fathers practiced? Chapter Hud, verse 87. Or does God command you, ya'murukum, to render back your trust to those whom they are due, and when you judge between man and man, that you judge with justice? Chapter An-Nisa, verse 58. An amr, or an amir, or military commander, amir, is the one who issues his order to the officers and soldiers who serve under him. A second meaning for al-amr is matter, business, or affair, as in, it is no business, al-amr of yours, whether Allah, so and so, Al-Imran 128, or so pass over their faults and ask for God's forgiveness for them and consult them in affairs, al-amr. Chapter Al-Imran 159. Al-Imar, al-Ammar is a pejorative term because it refers to a foolish or wicked act. Of example, said Moses, have you scuttled in order to drown those in it? Truly a strange thing, amran, have you done. Kahf 71. Al-Amara means sign or token. Al-Amara means sign or token, and Al-Imara is the place that is an emirate where the Amir, in Arabic Al-Amir, rules over his subjects. Al-Amr, in its many derivatives, occur 248 times in the book. In its meaning as order, al-amr, it can be both prescriptive, do it, and proscriptive, do not do it, thus containing internally and binary opposition, prescription or proscription, prescription or proscription, as well as an external opposition. If understood prescriptively, do it, an opposition to the proscriptive term, al-nahy, do not do it. Such binary oppositions structure human conscious behavior. Both terms, prescription and proscription, as a pair of contrasts, are dialectically linked to another pair of opposition, that is obedience and disobedience, because obedience and disobedience need prescription and proscription in order to be meaningful, and need choice and deliberation in order to be legally and theologically relevant. It is obvious that if someone receives an order but does not want to fulfill it, his disobedience will be vitiated. His disobedience will vitiate the order. If, however, he fulfills the order, he validates the order and expresses obedience to the one who gives it. Adam and his wife were given the choice to either obey or disobey God's proscription not to approach the tree. Baqarah 35. Iblis too had the choice, and he also decided to disobey when he refused God's prescription to bow down to Adam. They all bowed down except Iblis. He was one of the jinns and he broke the command of his Lord. Kahf 50. We have, however, to acknowledge that there are different categories of orders and that the importance of an order depends on the status, power, and authority of the one who gives it. Clearly, if Allah is the giver of an order, His orders will have a different authority than orders issued by human beings. The Arabic noun al-nahy is derived from the regular verb nahy, which basically means to reach. That is, to get to a stage where something has been completed or has come to an end. We say, I informed him, meaning in Arabic, I ended the news with him. أنهيته إليه الخبر. أنهيت إليه الخبر. I ended the news with him. Nahya means end. Nihaya means end and implies the limit or utmost degree of something. Nuhan means intelligence because reason and intelligence end foolish talk. Al-nahi implies an interdiction to say or do something. Its many cognates occur 56 times in the book. Most of them carry one of the meaning just explained, just like al-amr. It is dialectically linked to obedience and disobedience, which require free will in order to be meaningful. God said, what prevented you from bowing down when I commanded you? Al-Araf 12, which unambiguously refers to the existence of a rational mind that can freely think about its decision to obey or disobey. Proscription, just like prescription, consists of a dialectical process of communication between their sender and the receiver. The side that issues proscriptions can only do so because a receiver exists to whom prescription can be addressed. Proscriptions, just like prescription, are only meaningful if there is a possibility of obedience and disobedience on the part of the receiver, and the existence of choice between obedience and disobedience is only intelligible if no force is exercised by those who issue the order. We hear from the book that the first thing addressed to humans is a command by God, and that their response to this, that is their first ever response to the Creator, was an act of disobedience. By Adam's refusal to obey his Lord, he showed that he enjoyed freedom of choice. In this act of disobedience, he appears as someone who has decided on his own accord and under his duress and under no duress, because he decided deliberately to act against God's prohibition to go near the tree. But freedom of choice is not absolute and does not apply equally to everyone. Is there then a difference between God's word qawl and his command amr? God's irrevocable, compulsory words turn into objective reality, that is, the truth, in which there is no room for choice between obedience and disobedience. God's words cannot be disobeyed. In contrast to his words qawl, God's prescription amr can be disobeyed. This is why all verses of messengerhood were issued in the form of prescription or proscription, not as God's words. Verses that contain God's prescriptions to pray or fast never started with God said, Qala Allah, because this would mean that prayer and fasting are parts of objective reality and that people are compelled to pray or fast whether they want it or not. Iblis, one of the jinns, chose to disobey God's order and refused to bow down in front of Adam. This is why when Iblis was told to bow down in front of Adam, he did not receive God's order as his word qawl, but at his prescription amr, which left him with the choice to either follow or disobey it. As we said earlier, nahy, proscription, has often been mixed up with haram, absolute taboo. A few explanations are now necessary to clarify our position on this matter. First, conflation of the two terms must be avoided because the semantic and legal differences are simply too important to ignore. It is evident that every haram rule contains A prohibition, do not do it, but not every nahy rule expresses an absolute taboo, and it is therefore different from a haram rule. Second, unlike prescription, the book's haram rules are eternally valid. A new haram rule can only be introduced by a new revelation from God. For example, to introduce an absolute eternally valid ban on smoking would require a new message from God. Third, a haram rule is the sole prerogative of God, and no human being can ever claim to do like him. In contrast, a prescription can be issued by God, a prophet, and or human legislator. Have you seen the man who forbids yanha, or servant, to pray? On Alaq, verse 9 and 10. And fourthly, the historical sequence of God's command and orders require us to make a sharp distinction between nahy and haram first. First, it began with God's order to Adam and Adam and his wife, to stay in the garden, dwell, and to stay clear from the tree, do not go near. 2. Next, during the era of Abraham, we hear of God's order for a sacred space in Mecca. O Lord, I have made some of my offspring to dwell in a valley without cultivation by your sacred house, Baytik al-Muharram, Ibrahim 37. While continuing the theme of human dwelling from time of Adam, this introduces more complex notion of spatial sacrality with the concept of a sacred house. Number 3. This order was later complemented by orders that express temporal sacrality. The number of months in the sight of God is 12 in a year, so ordained by him the day he created the heavens and the earth. Of them 4 are sacred. Huruman, Tawbah 36.4. In legislation to the Israelites, Jacob, we come across a new concept, the notion of absolutely forbidden food. All food was lawful to the children of Israel except what Israel made unlawful for itself before the law of Moses was revealed. Al-Imran 93. 5. During the time of Moses, God revealed the 10 commandments in the form of prohibitions, do not, which at the time of Muhammad were upgraded to 10 absolute taboos. Say, come, I will rehearse what God has really prohibited, harama, you from. Al-An'am 151. The same applies to the law of usury, which used to be a simple proscription, nahy, to the Israelites, and which the book later issued an absolute taboo, haram. 6. Muhammad's message concluded the epoch of messengerhood, and in this way Allah closed the gate of eternally valid legislation in the form of absolute taboos and opened the gates of human historical legislation in the form of prescription and proscription, permission and prohibition. This allows doctors to order their lung disease patients not to smoke, and it allows a government to pass a new law that prohibits smoking in public places, and to order the police and the legal authorities to enforce it. Once the new law has been accepted by Parliament, the individual citizen is obliged to observe it, but he is free on a personal level to dislike the law and to air his discontent, provided that he does not try to impose his opinions on others. How are we then expected to read the phrase, if you avoid the grave sins you are prescribed to do, إن تجتنبوا كبائر ما تنهون عنه إن تجتنبوا كبائر ما تنهون عنه, in chapter 3 verse 31, chapter 4 verse 31. To what extent does this verse reflect the choice of humans to obey or disobey God's prescription? We notice in and ida. The difference between in and ida is however that while in states a condition whose fulfillment is uncertain, ida states a condition that is absolute and fulfilled. The use of the particle in for chapter 4 verse 31 tells us that the text wants to stress uncertainty uncertainty because it is not clear whether human beings will commit or avoid such grave sins, since this is a subject to their free choice. If they choose to obey, then they will avoid heinous crimes. If, however, they choose to disobey, they will commit them. Secondly, we notice the Arabic term kaba'ir for grave sins, literally meaning great or major, in contrast to small or minor sins, sagha'ir. The book refers to major sins 3 times and only once to minor sins by using the term lamam. If you but eschew the most heinous of things, kaba'ir, which you are forbidden to do, we shall expel out of you all the evil in you and admit you to a gate of great honor. Chapter Nisa, verse 31. Those who avoid great sins, kaba'ir, and shameful deeds, al-ithma wal-fawahish, only falling into small faults, lamam. Najm 32. Those who avoid the greater crimes, kaba'ir, and shameful deeds, al-ithma wal-fawahish, and when they are angry, even they forgive. Shura 37. These verses introduce a very relevant terminological clarification that is vital for our discussion on prescriptions versus proscription. The implicit distinction between major and minor sins in 431 is supported by chapter 53, verse 32, where great sins are explicitly distinguished from shameful deeds, al-ithm wal-fawahish, as we also find in chapter 42, verse 37. In order to establish their proper meaning against the meaning that these terms have acquired in Islamic fiqh, we need to distinguish between 4 different stages of interpretation: A, the Quran, the Prophet, the companions, and the second and third generation after the companions, of which only the first 2 encapsulates the term true meaning. Here we end the subject and we move on to major sins in the Quran is next.